Hello and welcome to the Club Room. I thought this week we would just do some science fiction book reviews or some commentary on some books if you prefer it that way. And yesterday I went for a stroll. It was really nice weather yesterday and it's nice weather today, and I went for a stroll out to a part of Bath I really go to, and I did a load of shooting and I put a video together, but decided it wasn't good enough. So I thought instead we'd go back to basics and do some SF, because we haven't done enough SF in the Club Room, so there will be more. And do let me know what you'd like to see more of, what you'd like to see less of, because, you know, we get lots of likes and things, which is great. And, you know, and you guys have sort of been faithful and stayed. I think of the 70 odd people who've joined, only 2 have left. And, you know, maybe it's not what they want. That's absolutely fine. So today we'll just talk about some SF books and a few other matters arising. It's sweet in my mouth. It's shocking, isn't it, really? Which I had just to sort of ease the throat before we begin. And I should start off by showing yet another postcard from Bruce Harper in Toronto, who is reading his way through all sorts of SF. And he sent me this Midwich Cuckoo's card, which got a bit torn in the post. And he's also sent me another one since of Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, which he's greatly enjoyed. And of course these are from the Penguin postcard SF box set, which you can still get, which is great really. So great gift for your SF loving chums. So I just thought we'd go through a few things, and as I've said recently on the channel, I have had a bit of a reading block, and it's given me great pain because of course I'm running a channel about reading, particularly reading SF. And when you're as long in the tooth as I am, and when you've read an awful lot of SF, you know, it's quite interesting watching other people doing all these books, especially younger people. But there's even some older people who've come to their hardcore moment of fandom much later. Like John at Sci-Fi Scavenger, for example, who's just fallen down the Dorset Bob rabbit hole. Bob's let him into the warehouse and he's just bought some things there. Oh gosh. And I hope to see Bob before Christmas, but it'll probably be early New Year. But, you know, you get to a point where you have read all the good stuff, or you have probably read most of the stuff that's going to appeal to you, because that's one of the things about these list books, including the one I wrote myself, is that what people select as their best of it won't always suit you. You've got to go with what suits you and with your instincts. So I am having one of my periods where I'm not really enjoying SF very much. I'm not really enjoying reading very much, apart from non-fiction. So it's quite a challenge. And when that happens, I tend to do 2 things with SF. I either stop reading it altogether, focus on the handful of people who are good, read non-fiction about SF, which I've read loads of, and you'll have seen the video the other day about that, and I didn't show all my SF reference books. And I think I've actually come to the kind of end of that as well, really. So we'll see. Or you go back to things, you know, and authors that you trust and things you've read before. So that's what I've been doing. But a few weeks ago, I flashed up a copy of this, Citizen of the Galaxy by Robert A. Heinlein, which I bought probably about a year ago, because this is an edition I used to sell. It's a Penguin from the 80s. And of course, this is one of Heinlein's juveniles. And the general critical consensus is that his juveniles are actually amongst his best books in terms of the craft and the quality of the writing, the execution. And this is about a young lad who is sold as a slave on a colony world, and obviously humanity is spread across the stars. And he's sold to this old guy who is spending some time, he's kind to him, and the old chap is basically imbuing him with this knowledge through hypnosis. And he says, you know, when this moment comes and you need to leave the planet. And supposedly there's a big conceptual breakthrough revolution at the end. But I have to say, even though the writing in this is far better than in most of Heinlein's books, it's so dull. I got 65 pages in, and it took me ages. And the book, the pacing is just so slow. And for a book published initially in the late 50s, it's actually quite long. It's about 270 pages long. And boy, that was too long. And it's also that thing about when you read a book for children or young adults, they don't always have adult concerns. So as an adult reader, it's very hard for you to remain engaged with the narrative. So this is a DNF. And Will it stay in the library? Well, as I've said recently, I am thinking of getting rid of a lot of books. One of the things that's always stopped me from getting rid of books is the fact that I tend to reacquire them because I think I might need them for reading or for study or for YouTube, for example. But another part of me is thinking, go with your instinct, which is to cut down just to the best, because I just cannot move in this house, as I'm always saying. So that is probably going to go. It was almost like a nostalgia buy, because I remember that jacket and things. You know, I've been nostalgia collecting. Well, I'm beginning to think that that was a really bad idea and that those things might need to be moved on. Anyway, speaking of a kind of nostalgia, you'll also see me the other day. I meant to flash this up. This is the best of Philip K. Dick in the US Del Rey edition. Not something that's hard to find, easy to find over here. And this was sent me by Richard at Vintage SF. And as I've said as well, Richard, me, Matt, Defoe at Science Fiction Reads, and Ira at SF Worlds of Wonder are going to do a 4-way review of this. But I've been rereading it. I need to stop because we're not going to do that for a month or so, and I'll forget a lot of the salient details. But what's interesting about this is that I've reread about the first 100 odd pages, first 150 pages, and it's all short stories, of course. And it's got some stories I've read many times, like his very early stories, Beyond Lies the Web and Rogue. And there's classic things. There's 3 in a row which are made into films. Imposter, Second Variety, and Paycheck. Now, Second Variety is much, much better in here than it is as the film. The film had Peter Weller in it. It's one of those films that's rather hamstrung by rather weak endings, where there's an ending, you think it's all over, then it's not, and then it is, then it's not. And that's the kind of thing John Carpenter did quite badly in a couple of his films. That happens in Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, which is the film I otherwise like, but there's too many recurrences of the menace, and that happens in the film version of Second Variety as well. But Second Variety is really good because it depicts Earth after a nuclear war in which there's really no winners, and it's the Soviet bloc versus the Americans, and it takes place in America, and it focuses on a handful of soldiers, and the place is just reduced to ash, and they're in this bunker, and they're not spending a lot of time venturing outside because there are factories which are manufacturing these killing machines, these small killing machines, which is different varieties of. And you get the impression throughout the narrative that the factories have become self-sustaining. There's nobody working in them. It's the machines making the machines. So it's an early example of what we're worried about now in AI, which is the idea that once machines can invent more intelligent machines, then we are really in trouble. AI will be more intelligent than us, and it'll create things which are more intelligent again. And that's the premise of Second Variety. And in the early stories of Dick, and throughout all his work, of course, one of the key themes is paranoia, that reality is not what you think it is. And there's a great little afterword in this where he talks about how he's the sort of guy, looks out at the crabgrass out in the front lawn, and he begins to think, is it really crabgrass? What's it thinking? Is it going to take over? And you get that whole paranoid thing that Dick's career was built on, and questions about the real and the unreal and how dangerous the ersatz was. And of course, that makes you think of William S. Burroughs. His quotation, I'm paraphrasing here, where Burroughs says something like, the paranoid is the guy who really knows what's going on. And I think that's probably the case. I've got this white thing here. Let's move it out of the way. Rather distracting, isn't it? Perhaps it's one of those sort of alien things that Dick wrote about. And it's a great story, and it's very, very bleak. And it comes across that the war is unwinnable. And it's so much better in the film because the film is set on an alien planet rather than on Earth. And you get that very doomy nuclear winter feel in this, and it's excellent. Also, Paycheck, I wanted to mention, because that was made into a film as well. And a rather bad film with Ben Affleck and Uma Thurman. Not that they're to blame. It's directed by John Woo. And of course, John Woo was like action, 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 action. And when I first heard that Woo was directing it, I thought, oh God, here we go again. This is going to be like Verhoeven with Total Recall. And where the dumb elements of the story get racked up and the clever ones get taken down. And of course, that's the big problem with Total Recall compared to the short story We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which it was based upon. And Cronenberg originally was the screenwriter and director for Total Recall, and he did about a dozen different scripts for it, and he had problems because the producer was Dino De Laurentiis, and he kept saying, oh, more car chases, more explosions, what have you. And in the end, Cronenberg said, no, I can't do this, I'm walking away from it. The central idea is really interesting, but it's just going to end up like fluff. And he's absolutely right, of course. It's a great shame because Verhoeven's skill really lay in war films. And okay, there's the heavy-handed satire of RoboCop, which comes into its best and its most amusing, and its finest really in his SF part of his career in Starship Troopers, which manages to be both faithful and original, and to parody the work, and also at the same time to sort of underline the political elements in it. But what Verhoeven was really good at was war films. If you see Soldier of Orange, which is a great film, and Black Book, they're probably his best things. But anyway, Cronenberg was supposed to be on it. But going back way to the point, this is John Woo and Verhoeven, both totally unsuited in my mind to the more thoughtful aspects of Philip K. Dick. And Paycheck, it's a really good story. And Paycheck is almost like a dry run for We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, because it sort of pivots on a similar thing. In We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, the central character is a down-at-heel chap, and the story begins with a typical Dickian scenario. A guy wakes up in the morning and straight away, he's a working stiff. He has an argument with his wife. You get that into Android's Dream as well. So it's instantly relatable to the real world, to the adult world. And he's going on about having a holiday on Mars where he can't afford it. So he decides to go to Recall Inc., who will basically place a false memory so he then thinks he's been to Mars, had his holiday, that he's actually been a secret agent undercover on Mars, and he'll remember all that, and he'll be satisfied with his life and get on with his life. And of course, when he goes under into the recall machine, the employees of the company realize that he actually did go to Mars and he actually was a special agent. Now in Paycheck, you get a similar thing where a guy wakes up and he's lost 2 years of his memory. And during those 2 years, he's been working for this company and he doesn't know what he's been working on. And he signed a contract whereby he would lose the memory of those 2 years, do the work, and he would get an awful lot of money at the end. So you can see how this was used by William Gibson and Johnny Mnemonic, because Johnny, loses bits of his memory in the film of Johnny Mnemonic. But the chap in Paycheck is slightly different. You've got a dystopian America where there's like a police state, which is growing more and more powerful. And the only people who can resist it are corporations, which is quite an interesting scenario. So it's a right wing versus a right wing, if you want to look at it that way. And when the guy wakes up, he's got a bag of trinkets, which he's taken in lieu of the huge amount of money. And he's signed a contract and he can't work out why. And basically inside this bag, there's things like there's a piece of cloth, there's half a poker chip, there's a key, these meaningless, valueless little things, which, he's thinking, why have I got these things? But of course, this is a very clever use of what critics call plot coupons. And by using these various elements, the protagonist of the story is able to get himself out of the situation, to gradually recover his memory to a degree at least about what's been happening, and to participate in resisting the police state who are after him. And it's a really great story, and there are moments in the film when it does come together, but there's other moments where it doesn't. But it is a typical example of the plot coupon thing. And in a lot of stories there are things like, for example, in Lord of the Rings, there's only one plot coupon, and that's the ring itself, and that powers the narrative. So if you've got quite a number of plot coupons, like if Tolkien had been really on it commercially, he'd have gone with all those different rings. There'd have been a novel for each one, and it would never have ended. It would be like a Robert Jordan thing. As it is, he left plenty behind. But that's a great example. But if you look at Michael Moorcock's Hawkmoon series, the first 4 particularly, each one of them is named after a plot coupon. There's the jewel in the skull, which is the first one. The jewel is embedded in Dorian Hawkmoon's head, and it's through that the Grand Britannian Empire, who had captured him, spy on their enemies. There's the Mad God's Amulet, which is the title of the second book. Then there's the Sword of the Dawn, which is the plot coupon for the third book. And in the fourth book, there's the Rune Staff, the final plot coupon, which is the culmination of things. So the plot coupon was alive and well in Dick, and it's a good little gambit to write a story, and if you can write a short story around it, it's really good. And reading these early short stories, which are from the early to mid 50s, the thing about them is you realize that when Dick was very young, he was one of those kids who was a child and an adolescent during the actual golden age. So he was reading people like Van Vogt, Heinlein, Campbell as a kid. And they were new. So he went through that whole thing. So Dick was a first generation golden age SF fan. So you can see the influence on him. There's a story called Colony, which is rather like John W. Campbell Jr.'s The Thing in some ways. But the Who Goes There is the title of the story, of course. And okay, you might see all this when I do this thing with Richard and the guys, but that's probably going to be on Richard's channel, so you may not. But the beauty of this is it shows how even earlier on, he was able to turn paranoia and his questioning of what was really going on beneath the surface of reality, some of which came from A. Van Vogt, it has to be said. It's the strangeness of Van Vogt which comes through in Dick. Into really great stories. And also in here you've got Imposter. There's a film of Imposter, which there's two versions. There's a short version which is 20 minutes long, which is on the DVD, and there's the feature-length version. The short version is much better because it's much more suited to the story. It doesn't need to be padded out the way that it is in the feature film. Not that it's a bad feature film, it's quite a good one. It's better than both Paycheck and Screamer's Second Variety, but the shorter version is better still. So it's sad really, you know, that this stuff didn't get picked up while he was alive. But as I say, you see the way that he would have read Van Vogt and Bester, and there's a certain sort of fire in Dick which reminds me of Bester, but it's not so linguistically explosive, because of course by the point Dick was writing these stories, Bester was well established as a short story writer and was starting to write novels. So there you go. So more on that when I do the review with the guys later on, but I've enjoyed going back to those stories. So something I didn't enjoy, and I will admit I didn't have high hopes for it, was this, Robert Silverberg's Kingdoms of the Wall, which I got about a year ago. And this is a 90 Silverberg. And I really sort of laid off buying late Silverbergs after reading one or two. And by late, I mean after Lord Valentine's Castle, so after the late 70s. Because really, you know, he put his passion into things. And he said himself that, you know, in those late 60s and early 70s books, he really poured his soul into them. And they won awards and things, but they weren't massive bestsellers the way they should have been. Like if everybody who read Dune read A Time of Changes, you know, Time of Changes doesn't have the world building. It doesn't need it. It covers a lot of the same themes. So he then sort of had his time out, did the bestseller thing with Lord Valentine's Castle, which is a fantasy novel, and then he produced a lot of quite workman-like books, and some of them are really good, some of them not so good. This was incredibly dull, and this is one of the worst Silverbergs I've read, and that includes some of the earliest material. I've avoided a lot of the very early material because I know it's hack work, and he considered it hack work himself, even though there are good ones like Invaders from Earth and Master of Life and Death, the two really good early ones. And I did a video probably about 2 years ago about some of the better early ones. But the premise of this, beautiful Jim Burns jacket, as you see, is that you have first-person narrator who's humanoid but not human, and these beings, and they live in villages on obviously an alien world at the foot of like a huge wall. And it's not a synthetic wall, it's not something that's been built, it's a natural structure. It obviously leads up to like a plateau and more mountains or what have you. And the people in this village, they go through this long selection process whereby they get selected down to a group of 40, and there's different stages in the selection as they grow up, to ascend the wall and to get to a certain point, hopefully meet the gods, learn how to live from their gods, and then they descend. And a lot of them, this happens every few years. A lot of them never come back. Some of the ones that come back are kind of like holy fools, and they can't really explain what's happened to them or describe it. So they're just like sort of wandering sages, as it were, or idiot savants more like, or maybe just village idiots. And it is that sort of thing where you get these rites of passage, and the beings in this, they're neuters. They're neuter most of the time, but they then acquire their sex or gender, however you want to put it, in these strange days, as they get the need to mate. So they're not male and or female, they're one or the other, but they don't acquire those characteristics until they need to. And the first person narrative, the central character, he has a slightly crooked leg, he has a friend who's physically weak but very intelligent, and they get selected. And this is basically a quest narrative. There's a lot of incident, but very little plot. And as they ascend up the wall, through the different sort of stages of climbing to different levels, they end up on a plateau. Then, there's lots of strange creatures and beings and experiences. And it's more like a fantasy narrative than an SF narrative. But it all seems rather hollow and empty and pointless. It was one of the least engaging, probably the least engaging Silverberg book I've read. And in the end, I found myself skip reading it because there's going to be some sort of conceptual breakthrough near the end. And I could almost see it coming. And there's a point where they meet somebody who is from another world. And, the message at the end and the discovery is quite trite. It's something that, really harked back to 1930s. And you just get the feeling that he did it for the money. And okay, he's a pro and he was writing for the market. And the market in the early 90s was starting to sort of go nowhere. There was a new kind of slickness in American SF. British SF was entirely tied up with the gene rats who came out of Interzone, and people like Ian Banks, Peter F. Hamilton, those people getting big. So it was bog standard space opera, and this really didn't satisfy. I'm going to keep it because it's a beautiful book and because I love Silverberg, but it was really disappointing. So I would actively say avoid this. It really is quite disappointing. But with a Jim Burns jacket, you're going to hang on to it anyway, aren't you? That's the thing. In despair about reading, I then decided, because I just look at things that I've got and I decide I can't face them, which is another reason I think get rid of things. Every now and again you must have a purge, because the weight of what you haven't read becomes too much and you'll never read it all. That's the thing. You'll never read it all. Nobody is well read. People can be widely read. I'm widely read, but nobody is well read. Let me tell you that. You work in the book trade and you realize that it's just one of those things. You can't read it all. You have to be realistic. And do you really want to spend all of your life reading? You don't. Even if you love it as I do, you mustn't spend all your life reading. You've got to have experiences and things. So I turned to a writer who I've mentioned on the channel, but I haven't mentioned this book very much. And it's a brilliant book and I love it to the bottom of my heart. And I decided to reread it because it'd been a long time. And that's The Man Who Fell to Earth by Walter Tevis. And this is my copy bought in 1976. And that, of course, is a pictorial representation of David Bowie. And a photograph like that was used for the cover of his album Low in 1977, came out early 77. And I bought this in 76. And I must have read this, I've probably read it a dozen times. The books that I read as a young person between about 1970 and 1980, I read and reread them if they were good. This was one of them. To Android's Dream was another. John Wyndham, Wells. I read and reread those books and I got a feel for the prose. And absolutely beautiful. This is why quite collectible now. And I've read other Tevis, one of his novels I haven't read The Colour of Money. And of course he wrote two types of books. He wrote science fiction, like The Steps of the Sun and Far From Home. And he wrote mainstream novels about games, like Queen's Gambit, which is about chess. And there's the two pool novels, Colour of Money and its predecessor, The Hustler, which of course was made into a film. And Tevis, of course, used to drink. He's quite a big drinker, so it's a bit of a problem, really. But I reread this, and I'm going to talk to you about it now, but I just want to talk about Far From Home briefly, because this book has great personal meaning to me, this actual copy. Beautiful jacket, as you see. This is a Corgi A format, and you see the whale in the swimming pool. That's actually from one of the stories. And I need to reread all of this, because I've only read one of the stories I've read twice. The others I've never reread. This was the book I bought on the first day I worked in a bookshop. So this is really important to me. So 40 years ago, it's 40 years and about a week, 40 odd years ago, I bought this on my first day in work, so it has enormous meaning to me. I've been looking for a Gollings Yellow Jacket and I can't find one, which is frustrating. I found one, but it was in a real state, but it's a really uncommon book. So The Man Who Fell to Earth, if you don't know the story, is, I mean, Norman Spinrad described this as one of the greatest science fiction novels, and I would completely agree with this. It was published in 1963, which is the year I was born. And it's about a man who falls to Earth. It's about an alien who comes to Earth. He is disguised as a human being. He comes from somewhere within the solar system, and he has a plan. And his plan involves raising a lot of money. And because he's come from another planet and his race are more advanced than ours, he's humanoid, but in disguise. They have technical abilities that we don't yet have. And he quickly manages to raise money for this project. And it really centers around him. And what comes across really well is the nature of the alien. And what it's really about is how we are all alienated. It's interesting because it's a classic example of what Ballard said. Earth is the only alien planet. And in this, from the very beginning, you see this man who calls himself Thomas Jerome Newton going through intense alienation on Earth. He's very slight of frame, very tall, and the gravity on Earth is much more than he's used to. He's from a smaller planet, which suggests Mars. And Mars is suggested throughout the book. It was never confirmed, but I pretty much think it is, because he calls the planet something else. He calls it Anthea. And you really get this sense of how strange it would be to go to another planet where there are humanoid beings. You're in disguise. You could be discovered. You're in grave danger. And the actual environment is really, really difficult for you. And that comes across, and his fragility and weakness. Yet where he comes from, he is probably the strongest man from his planet. He's chosen for his mission because of his physical strength. Yet on Earth, he's quite weak. And a little cadre of characters forms around him. There's Farnsworth, the accountant and lawyer, who Thomas Jerome Newton goes to help build his business empire on Earth. There's Betty Jo, who in the film is called Mary Lou, and there's a great film of this by Nick Roeg with David Bowie, as we say. And she is a plump, voluptuous, not unattractive woman who's on welfare. She's from a working class rural background. She drinks. And also there's a chemical engineer called Nathan Bryce, Professor Nathan Bryce, who is fascinated by some of the technological things that Newton comes up with and sells to throughout the world. And the first thing he does is he develops a photographic technique which is really, really unusual, and Bryce is fascinated by this. And Bryce is in a teaching job at university, and he's divorced and he's bored and he's seeking more stimulation, and he just thinks, gosh, you know, this process, it could almost be extraterrestrial. So this is a book which gradually turns the screw, and you see these characters each going through their own private hell. They're all alienated, they all have something missing from their lives, and they all drink. Even Newton becomes accustomed to drinking, and things gradually fall apart. And it's very tense. The writing is incredibly beautiful. It's very smooth and direct and simple. It isn't flowery, but Tevis really manages to focus on the feelings of alienation and loneliness and angst that these characters feel, but in a very, very subtle way. And that's the beauty of Tevis's writing. He writes about emotional pain with great facility, but with enormous subtlety. And he's not unsympathetic, but at the same time, there's a kind of objectivity there. You see these characters, and it's quite bold. They're very much, on the surface, they're very much tell books. He tells you the story, but he shows you through the dialogue and the small things about what happens. And The Man Who Fell to Earth is a classic example of genre science fiction as literature. Now, is it genre science fiction? Well, yes, because Tevis wrote short stories. They were published in SF magazines, and he had that going on, but he managed to escape from the trap of genre SF by writing things like The Hustler and Queen's Gambit. And of course, The Hustler was made into a film. It's very successful. And, you know, he obviously made some money from that. This wasn't made into a film until 1975. And it was published in 63. There are some suggestions that it was being revised, which I'm not certain about. If you've never read the book or seen the film, there was a TV adaptation recently, which I completely ignored because it was doing silly things with casting. Absolutely marvellous book. One of the finest SF novels I've ever read. I can't recommend it enough. It's not hand-wringing. It doesn't hand-wring. It presents all the sort of agonies, but it doesn't wring its hands, and it is beautiful. So, and it is in print. It's a Collins masterwork, and it's one of those books that really everybody should read, and the film is just marvellous. It's possibly my favourite film, certainly in my top 2 or 3 of all time. Interestingly, Steps of the Sun is the same story in reverse. It's about an Earthman who's rich, who decides to leave Earth. This isn't anywhere near as successful. And it says, Ben Belson is rich beyond belief, and yet all of his money can't restore the energy the Earth has squandered by the 21st century. He is one of billions living in the low-energy purgatory our planet has become. But he has a vision of finding cheap nuclear fuel in the stars. And it flips the plot of The Man Who Fell to Earth around. But I just don't know. It just doesn't come across. There is a kind... Tevis is much better with characters with more damage. This guy gets exasperated with people on Earth, and you can see it, but it's nowhere near as successful. And even though it's good, neither is Mockingbird, his other SF novel. His best works by far are The Man Who Fell to Earth and the wonderful Queen's Gambit, which I really think everybody should read. The thing about Queen's Gambit is that it's stunningly original. This is the Penguin Modern Classic for a few years ago. I first read it when it first came out. It's a little black and white Methuen paperback, and that was when I first started in the book trade as well. It was a new book then, and I read it at that point. And I don't know what happened to my original copy. Probably got rid of it when I got this. But this is so original. This is about a female chess master. When this was written, there were no female chess masters. Okay, there'd never been one. And this female chess master is an orphan. She grows up in an institution and she becomes addicted to painkillers. So it's got this really original stuff in it, and it's an amazing, amazing book. There was a Netflix TV series. Again, I couldn't watch it because the actress they cast just, to me, didn't seem right at all. But it's brilliant. You don't even have to understand chess. And there's a introduction by Lionel Shriver, the novelist, who says that she doesn't know how to play chess, but she loved this. And it is absolute work of genius. One of the best mainstream novels I've ever read. So there's a little look at what I've been reading recently and what I've been struggling with. I hope to break my my problem with reading and read some new stuff and review that for you soon on the main body of the channel. I hope you're all okay out there, and hopefully deliver some insights into some people we haven't covered. Though, as I've said, I am really drawn to reading people I really get on with at the moment. Like, I've got a couple of Thomas Dish novels I haven't read, and they're really calling to me because his prose is so good. So tell me below, actually, I'd be interested to hear from you guys. What do you do when you hit a problem with your reading, when you find that nothing's grabbing you? What do you do? What are your responses to that? Anyway, thanks for your membership. Really appreciate it. You are helping keeping the channel going through these times when I'm struggling with these sort of things. And also, I'm still struggling with my health. I know it's a bore. I saw Matt Bookpill the other day. He mentioned briefly his neck problem, which I've known about for several years, and I do feel for him. I'm continuing to have problems as I try and reduce my steroid dose, which is really quite tiresome. And with Christmas coming and being busy at work, that's quite a challenge. But I'm going to sign off now. I've got some errands to run, and I'll see you again soon on the main body of the channel in the club room again next week. Hope you're all well. Take care of yourselves, and let me know what you're reading and what you do when you're struggling with it, because I would love to know. Bye bye for now.